Rome, in the first century of our era, is a city that consumes stories as eagerly as it consumes bread and wine. It is a capital built on spectacle, of conquest, of politics, of faith, of tragedy. And in this vast, shifting world of triumph and ruin, power belongs to the man who can control the narrative as much as the sword. That man at this moment of history is Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, a name that evokes excess, fear, fascination, and myth. An emperor remembered for the fire that devoured Rome, for the golden palace he built, for the artists he forced to applaud his performances, for the enemies he condemned, and for the spiral that dragged him from absolute authority to a hunted fugitive. But behind these tales, behind the legends and the exaggerations, lies a story far more intimate and far more disturbing. The story of Nero and Sporus, a relationship that defies categories, neither love nor politics, neither simple cruelty nor pure obsession. A relationship born not from desire but from grief, not from ambition but from loss, and ultimately from a psychological wound so deep it reshaped the court, the empire, and the memory of an entire era. Before Sporus entered Nero's life, another figure dominated the emperor's world, Empress Poppaea Sabina, a woman of beauty, ambition, and influence, a woman adored and feared, a woman whose death at the hands of her own husband would become one of the most shocking tragedies of imperial Rome. And it is precisely here, in the vacuum left by her absence, that the strange and tragic story of Sporus begins. Poppaea's death in AD 65 shook the imperial palace to its core. Nero, who had struck her in anger during an argument while she was pregnant, was devastated once the reality of her death settled in. In the days and weeks that followed, he became erratic, inconsolable, and obsessed with recreating her presence. He ordered state funerals of unprecedented grandeur. He demanded temples, altars, statues, anything that could anchor Poppaea to the living world. He forced philosophers to justify her deification. He spoke to her portrait. He refused to allow servants to remove her clothes, her perfume jars, or her jewelry from their place. The Emperor of Rome had lost the one person who could pacify his darkest impulses. Inside the palace, a strange silence spread. Courtiers moved cautiously. Servants whispered in corners. Tigellinus, the head of the Praetorian Guard and Nero's most loyal enforcer, watched carefully, knowing that a grieving emperor could be the most dangerous of all. Rome continued its daily chaos beyond the palace walls. But inside, everything revolved around a single absence, and absence soon demanded a substitute. Nero did not seek to replace Poppaea. He sought to recreate her. Her voice, her gestures, her beauty, her manner of walking. As though the world itself could be bent to restore what fate had taken from him. At first, he surrounded himself with women who resembled her in one way or another. But none possessed the delicate, ethereal presence that Poppaea had embodied. None could occupy the emotional space she had held. Nero's grief turned into obsession. He began to see Poppaea's face everywhere, in statues and paintings, in the profiles of strangers. Then came the day when the emperor's eye fell on a young adolescent, whose features were so strikingly reminiscent of Poppaea that the court froze in shock. His name was Sporus. Historians describe him as a boy of delicate beauty, soft-featured, almost feminine in appearance. He was young, too young to understand the danger that accompanied Nero's gaze. He was powerless, too powerless to refuse what would come next. And he was beautiful, far too beautiful for his own safety in a palace ruled by emotion rather than reason. The emperor believed he had found a living echo of Poppaea, and that belief changed everything. Once the idea took shape in Nero's mind, no advisor, senator, or general attempted to oppose it. The emperor ordered that Sporus be placed under imperial protection. He received new clothing, assigned attendants, and accommodation within the palace. Nero visited him regularly. He spoke to him quietly. He associated Sporus with memories he was unwilling to abandon. Poppaea had been a woman, Sporus was not. To reduce this difference, Nero made a decision that even in Rome was considered unusual. Historians still describe it with surprise. Nero ordered that Sporus be castrated. It was not a punishment. It was not a legal measure. It was intended as a transformation, an alteration of the body to match the image the emperor kept of Poppaea. An imposed adjustment meant to address grief more than desire. Rome had known harsh actions and abuses of power, but this event was distinct. It illustrated the imbalance between absolute authority and individual vulnerability. Sporus did not choose this outcome. It was imposed upon him. In the weeks following the procedure, the atmosphere in the palace shifted again. Sporus no longer moved through the palace as a servant or detainee, but as someone being prepared for a defined role, a role no one openly described. For Nero, this decision seemed to ease his mourning. For others, it was a source of unease. Courtiers adjusted their behavior. Servants avoided direct gaze. Senators withheld their reactions. Visitors concealed their surprise. Nero's expectations became the norm within the court. Sporus became central to this new arrangement. The events involving Nero and Sporus form one of the more troubling episodes recorded from antiquity. It is not a romantic narrative, not a scandalous affair, not an exotic anecdote. It is a story involving grief, authority, and identity taken by force. A situation in which an emperor, unwilling to confront the consequences of his own actions, altered another person's life to assuage his internal conflict. The tragedy of Sporus is that of an individual turned into a symbol without consent, a living reminder, a political construct, a reflection of the darker aspects of imperial power. It is at this turning point that the core of the narrative truly begins. Grief is a dangerous companion for a man who commands an empire. For ordinary people, grief bends the back, dims the eyes, slows the step. But for an emperor, a man surrounded by fear, flattery, and the intoxicating certainty that every whim is law, grief can twist reality itself. Nowhere is this more evident than in Nero's palace in the months following Poppaea's death. The imperial residence on the Palatine Hill, once filled with music, gossip, and the laughter of guests, became an enormous mausoleum. Not a day passed without Nero demanding some new ritual of mourning, a procession of incense, a recitation of tragic verses, a retelling of how radiant Poppaea had been during her final days. Musicians played the soft, melancholic melodies she had loved. Slaves dressed in muted colors and walked with bowed heads. Noble women attended court wearing veils as if in perpetual funeral. Even Rome's festivals, those great beats of joy in the city's calendar, were forced into a quieter rhythm. Behind closed doors, senators whispered that the emperor had drifted into madness. Behind other doors, Nero whispered to the walls, imagining Poppaea's presence in the shadows. He demanded that her chambers remain untouched, her ivory comb arranged beside the bronze mirror, her perfumes sealed in small crystal bottles, her silk garments draped neatly, as if she might return at any moment to wear them. The palace held its breath. Nero had always been a man prone to extremes. He could be generous, artistic, passionate, and then in the space of a heartbeat, petty, violent, or tyrannical. In the beginning of his reign, Seneca and Burrus had tempered his impulses, but by the time Poppaea died, those stabilizing voices were either gone or powerless. What remained was an emperor who believed that the world existed to soothe him. When grief came, he did not seek solace. He sought restitution. That is why the search began. Not openly, not formally, but in whispered suggestions from slaves, freedmen, and court attendants eager to calm their unstable master. But Nero rejected them all. Some were too tall, some too dark, some too pale, some laughed incorrectly. One cried too loudly, another walked too confidently. None had Poppaea's softness, or at least none matched Nero's idealized memory of her. Reality could not compete with grief's imagination. This was when the suggestion came, quietly, dangerously, that perhaps the emperor should not look for a replacement among women. Perhaps what he truly sought could be found elsewhere, in a place where malleability outweighed nature, and where the body could be shaped to match memory. This was the moment the empire's path began to curve toward the tragedy of Sporus. The exact circumstances under which Nero first saw Sporus are lost to history. The sources disagree. Some claim he was a palace page, others that he was part of a noble household, or a slave captured for his unusual beauty. What they all agree on is this: Sporus's appearance stunned the court. He was extraordinarily delicate, not simply handsome, but possessing a kind of androgynous, luminous charm that stood out even in a culture accustomed to admiring youthful beauty. He had the soft oval face that Roman writers associated with idealized femininity. His eyes were described as gentle, expressive, almost sorrowful. His skin was pale, untouched by the sun. His manner was quiet, hesitant. The manner of someone who understood early in life that silence could be a shield. In another life, his beauty might have made him a poet's muse. In this life, it made him the object of an emperor's grief. When Nero saw him, he did not see a boy. He saw Poppaea's shadow, and shadows he believed could be sculpted into reality. Nero ordered Sporus to be brought before him. The boy stood trembling, unsure whether he was being considered for service, punishment, or something else entirely. The emperor studied him with the intensity of a painter examining a blank canvas, one he already knew how he wanted to fill. According to later historians, Nero walked around him slowly, as if searching for flaws, as if measuring how close fate had allowed this boy to mimic the woman who haunted his dreams. Then Nero said the words that sealed Sporus's fate. He is perfect. Perfect, not for who he was, but for what he could become. From that moment onward, Sporus ceased being simply a boy. He became a vessel for Nero's grief. Roman aristocrats were no strangers to shocking behavior. They had seen emperors kill, exile, torture, humiliate, and desecrate. But what Nero began planning for Sporus unsettled even the most jaded senators. It was not merely immoral, it was unnatural. It challenged Roman conceptions of masculinity, hierarchy, and dignity. It reeked of personal madness, not political intent. And yet no one dared intervene. Sporus, for his part, understood only fragments of what awaited him. He knew Nero was drawn to him. He knew servants looked at him with pity, with fear, with the pity of fear that comes from witnessing a tragedy in motion. His life no longer belonged to him. Nero's private physicians were summoned. They arrived in the emperor's chamber in silence, each man aware that refusal was impossible and hesitation dangerous. The emperor told them plainly, "You will preserve his beauty." That was all, no explanation, no justification. The meaning was clear enough. In the ancient world, castration existed, but it was legal only under specific circumstances, and always condemned when forced upon a freeborn Roman. Nero, however, was beyond the reach of law. The physicians performed the procedure. Sporus survived physically. Whether he survived emotionally is another question entirely. The court shuddered. The emperor rejoiced. He believed he had undone death itself. After the operation, Nero's attention intensified. He supervised the boy's clothing, his grooming, his training in posture and speech. He ordered tailor-made garments based on Poppaea's own dresses, soft fabrics dyed in gentle purples and golds. He taught Sporus how Poppaea had spoken, how she had tilted her head when amused, how she had walked with quiet grace. He rehearsed the memories he wanted to relive. Sporus became a living portrait, no longer a person but an extension of Nero's denial. A vessel for a ghost who refused to rest. And as horrifying as this was for Sporus, it also revealed something else. Nero's madness was not driven by lust. It was driven by mourning so consuming that it devoured identity. In this tragic alchemy of grief and power, the emperor remade a human being like clay. Outside the palace walls, rumors drifted through taverns, bathhouses, and marketplaces. Some said Nero had found a new lover, a boy dressed as a woman. Others whispered that he planned to marry this young ghost of Poppaea in a public ceremony. Still others insisted that the emperor was trying to cheat death itself. Romans had always loved scandal, but this scandal felt different, darker, more sorrowful, almost mythic in its strangeness. People compared Nero to mythical figures, to Pygmalion, who fell in love with his own statue, to Orpheus, who refused to accept the death of his beloved, to Hades, who claimed a living soul for the underworld. Yet unlike myth, this story was not symbolic. It was real, and its victim had a name, Sporus. By the end of this period, Nero's transformation of Sporus was nearly complete. But grief demands rituals, and Nero's ritual would soon be the strangest ever performed by an emperor. He planned a wedding, not a private arrangement whispered in hallways, but a public ceremonial union, meant to erase Poppaea's death by replacing her entirely. A wedding where Nero would play the role of groom, and Sporus, dressed in imperial garments, would play the role of empress. Rome prepared to witness something it had no words for. The story of Nero and Sporus, the story of a boy forced into the shape of a dead woman, was about to cross the threshold from personal tragedy into public history. And once crossed, there would be no turning back. Rome had seen strange spectacles. Triumphs with exotic animals, gladiators reenacting naval battles, emperors declaring themselves gods. But nothing prepared the city for the ceremony Nero was about to unveil. For centuries, Roman marriage had been a practical institution. It aligned families, secured inheritances, or served political alliances. Even the most flamboyant emperors had treated marriage with a certain formal dignity. And yet, in the year 67, Rome witnessed something that defied custom, morality, and belief itself. Nero married Sporus, not in a whisper, not behind closed doors, but in a public ceremony crafted with the same care Nero once devoted to state functions, artistic performances, or religious festivals. To understand the enormity of this moment, one must step into the palace on the night of the wedding. The palace glittered with the most extravagant decorations Nero's artisans could assemble. Wall hangings glowed in candlelight, garlands perfumed the air. Musicians prepared their instruments with trembling hands, unsure whether their presence honored the dead or insulted the living. Sporus stood in the center of the preparations like a fragile relic encircled by worship and fear. He wore the garments of an empress, a flowing dress of shimmering gold, embroidered with patterns Nero personally chose from Poppaea's old wardrobe. The fabric hung on a frame that had been reshaped by violence. He moved stiffly, painfully, but without protest. He had no choice. Attendants painted his face lightly, accentuating his softness, muting any hint of the masculine, reinforcing the illusion Nero demanded, the illusion that Poppaea still lived, and that death itself had bowed to the emperor's will. The guests were a mixture of terrified courtiers, ambitious senators, and a handful of performers Nero admired. Some of them had been forced to attend, others came willingly to avoid suspicion. Each man and woman present understood that this was not a wedding. It was a decree of madness. But in Rome, madness was contagious when it flowed from power. Nero entered the room dressed in ceremonial robes usually reserved for triumphs. He carried a veil, Poppaea's veil, which he placed gently on Sporus's head. The gesture, profoundly symbolic, was normally performed by the groom for the bride during a Roman wedding. Now it bound an emperor to a boy who resembled his dead wife. Priests were summoned to bless the union. They hesitated, unsure whether the gods would tolerate such a spectacle. But hesitation was dangerous in Nero's Rome, so they recited the blessings, voices shaking. Guests applauded, lightly, quickly, because silence could be interpreted as dissent. Nero smiled, satisfied. For a moment he believed he had defeated loss. After the ceremony, Nero insisted that Sporus be addressed with the title Sabina, in honor, or mockery, of Poppaea Sabina. He introduced Sporus at banquets, at receptions, sometimes even at public events, the empire whispered. Satirists joked that Nero had married a ghost. Philosophers debated whether nature had been violated or merely ignored. Poets speculated whether grief could become a form of tyranny. To the Roman people, Sporus became a symbol of decadence, of cruelty, of the emperor's spiraling instability. But to himself, he was something far more tragic. A prisoner inside a role written by a man who could not bear the truth. Sporus lived in gilded confinement, adored and suffocated, dressed in jewels and trauma, praised as an empress but treated as a memory. He was neither man nor woman, neither slave nor free, neither loved nor forgotten. He was an image, a reflection, a ghost given flesh. Sporus's days followed a rigid routine, one designed to maintain the illusion Nero needed to survive. He was awakened by attendants who helped him dress in women's garments. His hair was styled into elaborate curls. His face was powdered and shaded. Every gesture was calibrated to maintain the performance. He would sit beside Nero during audiences. He nodded when expected, smiled on cue, spoke rarely. He was a silent ornament, a reminder of Poppaea's presence, a balm to Nero's wounded ego. At night, Sporus was displayed like a trophy. He reclined at Nero's side, accepting compliments he did not desire, enduring stares that burned through him. Behind closed doors, Nero treated Sporus with a tenderness that made the situation even more disturbing. Not lustful tenderness, but the tenderness one offers a ghost, a hallucination, a fragile dream. Nero never called him by his real name. Only Poppaea, only my Sabina. Sporus lived in a perpetual performance of someone else's life. The marriage had bound Nero and Sporus together, but it had also bound the entire imperial court to a dangerous illusion. Life in the palace became a theater where every expression, gesture, and word had to support the emperor's fragile fantasy. No one could contradict Nero. No one could speak Poppaea's name without trembling. No one could acknowledge that Sporus was a boy forced into the image of a dead woman. In Nero's palace, truth was treason, and treason was death. Nero had once been an emperor who navigated politics with surprising agility. He had outmaneuvered rivals, controlled public opinion, and captivated the people with performances, festivals, and gifts. But the death of Poppaea had fractured him. Now his reign was defined not by ambition, but by avoidance. He avoided decisions, he avoided reality. He avoided anything that reminded him of the world outside the cocoon of memory he was weaving. Sporus became the keystone of this fragile construction. If Sporus failed, the illusion failed. If the illusion failed, Nero would be confronted by the full weight of his crime, the death of Poppaea and her unborn child. So the emperor clung to Sporus with a possessive desperation. A desperation the palace could feel like a change in air pressure. In private and public alike, Nero addressed Sporus as Sabina, the name of Poppaea, the name of someone who no longer existed. At banquets, Nero would place his hand on Sporus's and whisper, "My Sabina lives again." He did this not only for his own comfort, but for the audience watching. He needed the court to confirm the narrative that Poppaea had not truly died, only been transformed. If Nero believed it, they had to believe it. And if they failed to believe it, they had to pretend. Pretending became an act of survival. To understand the tragedy of Sporus, one must imagine his daily reality. A young person forced to mirror a woman he had never known, trapped in a palace where grief carried the weight of law. Sporus was trained to walk as Poppaea had walked, gracefully, silently, with slow, deliberate movements. He practiced her speech patterns, her posture, her manner of smiling faintly without revealing too much of her teeth. Every gesture was a borrowed gesture, every moment a reenactment. He was dressed in elaborate gowns woven with gold thread, perfumed with the scents Poppaea had favored, adorned with jewels from the imperial treasury. He became a living museum, a moving tribute sculpted from trauma. He did not speak unless spoken to. He did not look anyone directly in the eyes unless Nero allowed it. He did not display anything resembling autonomy. Autonomy belonged to Nero. Sporus belonged to Nero's grief. Among the nobles and courtiers, fear was matched only by fascination. Some pitied Sporus, quietly, secretly, from a distance. Some saw him as a tragic figure caught in the gears of imperial madness. Others sought opportunities. If Sporus could sway the emperor, even unintentionally, then he was a potential conduit for influence. A few attempted to ingratiate themselves with him, offering compliments, gifts, or whispered advice. But this was dangerous. Nero watched Sporus with obsessive vigilance. If the emperor sensed that someone was trying to use his Sabina, he reacted with violence. Sporus quickly learned to remain neutral, to neither accept nor reject attention, to navigate a world where every kindness was a trap and every conversation a test. He lived in a palace of masks. But his mask was the most fragile of all, because it was not a disguise but a role forced onto him by the most powerful man in the world. While Nero found comfort in this arrangement, the court saw only danger. Each day the emperor drifted further from reality. Each decision became more erratic, each punishment more disproportionate. His marriage to Sporus became a symbol of his detachment, a sign that the emperor no longer saw people as individuals, but as pieces in his psychological theater. Senators murmured that the empire was being ruled by a man who had replaced reason with fantasy. Generals began questioning whether the emperor still understood the world beyond his palace walls. Tigellinus, Nero's loyal enforcer, watched the situation with unease. He had supported Nero through assassinations, purges, and conspiracies. But this was different. This was not politics, this was illness. And illness in an emperor could bring down an empire. Rome gossiped endlessly about the wedding. Some treated it as comedy, others viewed it as blasphemy. Many saw it as a dangerous omen. Satirists whispered jokes behind closed doors. Nero could not revive Poppaea, so he simply created a new one. Others murmured, "He has married death itself." But no one dared say these things publicly, not while Nero's spies roamed the streets, not while dissent was still punishable by torture, exile, or execution. So Rome did what Rome often did with absurdity. It turned it into spectacle, rumor, entertainment. And in the center of this storm stood Sporus, a boy of 17 or 18 with no power of his own, trapped in the emperor's grief, forced to live a life he never chose. Slowly, the marriage began to gain political meaning. Some courtiers saw Sporus as a potential influence on Nero, a calming presence, even if created by cruel means. Others viewed him as a tool to manipulate the emperor's decisions. Sporus himself became aware of this. His silence, his obedience, his fragility, all became weapons others tried to wield. He was a pawn, but a pawn so delicate that every faction sought to claim him. Nero, blind to the political implications, saw only Poppaea. He believed the past had been rewritten. He believed the world had forgiven him. But history does not forgive, it only waits. And the story of Nero and Sporus was about to collide with the story of Rome itself. The rebellions, the conspiracies, the collapse of Nero's authority, the unraveling of an emperor who could no longer distinguish grief from governance. This wedding was only the beginning. The descent, slow, tragic, and inevitable, would define the rest of their intertwined lives. History remembers emperors. It records battles, laws, victories, disasters. It inscribes the names of those who shaped nations, ruled armies, and transformed the world through ambition or genius. But sometimes history is shaped not by the powerful, but by the powerless. Not by the conqueror, but by the victim. Not by the emperor, but by the echo he left behind. Sporus was such an echo. His life, marked by silence and suffering, reveals truths about an empire at its psychological breaking point, and about a ruler who believed he could bend the world, and even death, to his will. This conclusion gathers the pieces of their story, not to excuse Nero, and not to romanticize Sporus's tragedy, but to illuminate what their strange, haunting relationship tells us about power, grief, identity, and the fragility of empires. Nero's world collapsed suddenly, violently, and irreversibly. The revolts in Gaul and Hispania, the betrayal of the Praetorian Guard, the Senate's condemnation, all of it struck faster than the emperor could respond. The palace that once cocooned Nero in fantasy now became a cage. The servants who once bowed with trembling obedience now vanished into the shadows. The guards who once protected him now melted away like a dream at dawn. The luxurious rooms where he rehearsed his illusions now echoed with desertion. In the middle of this collapse stood Sporus, still dressed in the garments forced upon him, still the mirror of a ghost, still treated by Nero as Poppaea's resurrected shadow. Nero did not let him go. He clung to Sporus until the final hours of his life. But illusions cannot survive the weight of history. The world Nero built, a world in which death could be undone and grief could be sculpted into a living form, fell apart. And when Nero fled the palace in disguise, Sporus was taken with him. Even at the end, the emperor could not face the world without his living echo beside him. When the Senate declared Nero a public enemy, the sentence carried one implication. He would die the death of a criminal, beaten, humiliated, displayed for public mockery. Nero, terrified of such an end, turned to the few companions who remained, a handful of loyal freedmen, and Sporus. It is here, in the ruins of his dignity, that the truth of Nero's relationship with Sporus becomes painfully clear. Nero asked Sporus to perform the role Poppaea had once filled. Not his wife, not his lover, but his comfort. He cried in Sporus's arms. He begged him for reassurance. He spoke to him as though he were speaking to Poppaea in the last seconds of his life. And then, moments before the soldiers arrived to seize him, Nero realized the final irony. He could no longer command even himself. His freedman Epaphroditus helped guide his hand as he stabbed himself. Nero died whispering, "Qualis artifex pareo." What an artist dies in me. But another unrecorded truth is this. He also died with Sporus at his side, the last witness to his downfall, the last fragment of his delusion. One might imagine that Nero's death freed Sporus, but empires are cruel to the powerless. After Nero's suicide, the year of the four emperors began, a chaotic civil war where generals scrambled for power. Sporus, instead of disappearing into anonymity, became a symbol, a curiosity. An ornament passed from one powerful man to another. Otho, one of the claimants to the throne, took Sporus as a companion, perhaps out of cruelty, perhaps out of political theater, perhaps because he too had been married to Poppaea and saw in Sporus a strange, unsettling reminder of the past. Vitellius, Otho's enemy and successor, treated Sporus even worse. He planned to reenact a scene from mythology in which a royal victim is forced to die in theatrical humiliation, and he wanted Sporus to play the part. The boy who had survived Nero's grief was now trapped in the violent fantasies of a new ruler. Faced with this final degradation, Sporus made the only choice he still controlled. He took his own life. He died young, likely in his late teens or early 20s. He died not as an empress, not as an ornament, not as a trophy, but as a human being who had been denied the right to be himself. What does the story of Sporus tell us? It tells us that power, absolute, unchecked, worshipped, can consume not only the world around it, but the very soul of the one who wields it. It tells us that grief, when fused with authority, can transform into a weapon. It tells us that an empire that could not protect a child from its ruler was already rotting at its core. Nero is remembered as a tyrant, an artist, a madman, a murderer, a tragic figure, or a misunderstood soul, depending on which lens one chooses. But Sporus is remembered as a shadow, and this is the true tragedy. Rome documented the emperor's psychological collapse in meticulous detail, but gave only a few lines to the suffering of the boy trapped inside that collapse. Sporus remains one of history's most haunting silences, a silence created by violence, sustained by fear, and preserved by the indifference of those who survived. Nero's death did not heal Rome. Civil war tore the empire apart. New emperors rose and fell. The Flavian dynasty rebuilt the city, restored stability, and reshaped the imperial image. But the story of Nero and Sporus did not fade. Historians repeated it with horror. Poets used it as a symbol of excess. Philosophers cited it as evidence of tyranny's madness. Satirists whispered about it for generations. Why? Because buried beneath the scandal and spectacle lies a universal truth. Power that tries to conquer death will always destroy the living. Nero wanted to bring Poppaea back, but in doing so, he consumed Sporus's life. He wanted to undo guilt, but he created new suffering. He wanted control over fate, but fate swallowed him, and everyone around him. Sporus became the price of Nero's refusal to face the reality of his own actions, and that price was paid in silence. History rarely asks this question. It focuses on the emperor, his madness, his grief, his downfall. But Sporus was more than an imperial curiosity. He was a person, a young person, someone who deserved a life, an identity, a future. Instead, his body was reshaped by force. His name was erased. His gender was overwritten. His autonomy was stolen. His suffering was turned into entertainment. And his death became a footnote in the biography of a tyrant. Yet in the end, the fact that we still speak of him, that we still wrestle with the meaning of his short, tragic life, gives Sporus a form of justice. History tried to bury him in silence, but by telling his story, we break that silence. The tale of Nero and Sporus is not a love story. It is not a scandalous romance. It is not a curiosity from a decadent age. It is a warning about the dangers of unchecked power, a warning about the human cost of imperial grief, a warning about what happens when a single man's emotional wounds become the wounds of an entire empire. Sporus was the victim of a world that valued power over personhood, spectacle over humanity, and illusion over truth. And yet his story survives, not because he held power, not because he commanded armies, not because he shaped history, but because history, at its most honest, remembers the echoes and the fragile voices, the hidden victims, the lives distorted by the violent dreams of the powerful. Sporus was one such voice, a voice finally heard, a story finally told, and a shadow that, in the end, outlived the emperor who created it. Like the video and subscribe.